go there. They focus in on the people who are the miscegenated types living in the cities. They're ignoring the dark types that are indistinguishable from the Senegamians living in the deserts. All right, so I'm just pointing that out. Okay, so we can see that this DNA test lines up with what I've been saying, that a good bulk of what came in as African slaves, in fact, were from Europe. The DNA is showing it. And that's why I know it, because of the DNA. All right, next slide. Okay, this is an article called African Slaves in Colonial Australia. And the only reason, from The Guardian, the only reason I'm showing this is because of what they say on the next slide. If you go down to the highlighted, it starts talking about what became of Africans living in England. And let's read it. For those who remained in London after the 1600s, life was not easy. In 1786, the plight of the African English was so bad that £900 was donated by the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor. Destitute, some turned to crime to eat. They were duly arrested and sentenced to the colonies. These poor people went from slavery to penal servitude. So here you have an admission that there was a movement of people from Europe sent into slavery. But that's not something that's ever taught. But the DNA shows that has been the case. And that was not a small movement. Okay, next slide. All right, Ireland and Scotland slaves, part 2. Let's go to the next slide. So this is an article, and it talks about how you had 300,000 Irish slaves sent into the Caribbean. And if you read here, it says during the mid-1600s, Irish were the main slaves sold to Antigua and Montserrat, to the extent that 70% of the total population of Montserrat consisted of Irish slaves. Ireland became an important source of human stock for English merchants. Ireland's population fell from about 1.5 million to 600,000, 1641 to 1652, when more than 500,000 Irish were killed by the English and another 300,000 were sold as slaves. Families were torn apart because Irish men were forbidden to take their wives and children with them, which led to a sizable population of homeless women and children that were resolved by auctioning them into slavery too. During the 1650s, in the region of 100,000 Irish children between ages 10 and 14 were taken from parents to be sold as slaves in the West Indies and New England. In this decade, 52,000 Irish, mostly women and children, were sold to Barbados and Virginia. Another 30,000 Irish men and women were also transported and sold to the highest bidder. In 1656, Cromwell ordered that 2,000 Irish children be taken to Jamaica and sold as slaves to English settlers. Now, this was extensive, but who's to say everybody was pale? Let's go to the next slide. There were exceptionally high proportion of Scots plantation owners in the Caribbean islands of St. Kitts and Jamaica, as to Virginia and the American colonies. Scots merchants and investors financed Scots slave traders such as Richard Oswell, who organized large-scale undertakings to capture, transport, and sell slaves from West Africa, with voyages leaving from all the main UK ports. See, they keep saying they went to West Africa, but notice these slave ships left the UK, that transported about 3.4 million of the 10 million Africans to slavery in the colonies in America and the Caribbean. What is less well known are the large number of Scots, estimated at around 100,000, who were rounded up and transported to the colonies to be sold into slavery, many of them as a result of the Highland clearances after the union with England in 1707, and particularly after the 1745 Jacobite Rising. Political prisoners were regularly sold into slavery, and the 1746 Act of Proscription stated that anyone wearing tartan or Highland dress would be transported. Okay, let's go to the next slide. People from the British Isles, mainly, but not only Irish and Scots, sentenced to transportation for petty crimes, others kidnapped, were put in chains, then packed into ships that transported hundreds of them bound for Virginia, Boston, New York, Barbados, and the West Indies. Now, this is the same story that they describe in terms of the transportation of Africans from West Central Africa. But we're not told about this story. And just because someone is from Ireland and Scotland or England does not mean they're pale. The white slaves were treated the same or even worse than black slaves. White slaves did not sell for a good price at auctions. Thus, it has been recorded that planters treated blacks better than their Christian white servants. Okay, that's just next slide. So this is an article, and this is very interesting. This is an article from the paper called The Scotsman, and the title of it is The Search for the West Indian Man Who Stood Alongside the Jacobites at Culloden. So work is underway to trace the identity of a black man who is believed to have been on the field with the Jacobites at the Battle of Culloden. So this is a tapestry, okay? And it's shown actually in a museum. And according to them, they don't understand or know why this man is dressed in costume. And he's clearly active in the battle, and he's black. All right, let's go to the next slide. Research is now underway to find out the identity of the man in the tapestry, which hangs at the Battle of Culloden Visitor Center, and the story behind his journey to the Highlands. Okay, see, that's like a tease, but the point is, he's there, he's black, and he's from the Highlands, and he's clearly part of the Battle of Culloden. Okay, and from that battle, Jacobites were sent to the Caribbean. All right, let's go to the next slide. The first paragraph, I would like to read that. Miss Melvin said that Britain had been for centuries, if not millennia, a bustling scene of ethnic diversity with its known black people. With it known black people lived in Scotland since at least Roman times. So there's an admission, okay, that there was a black presence there. At least there's an admission. So the tapestry now being researched was acquired by National Trust for Scotland to display at Culloden in 2007. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the Jacobite Gleanings from State Manuscripts, Short Sketches of Jacobites to Transportation to 1745 by J. Macbeth Forbes. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So we can see there's a description of various Jacobites. We can see here the highlighted one. There was an Edinburgh writer, George Hume, age 30, marked as a black man whose color would no doubt suit the West Indies. So as you can see, There was various complexions, as we would expect. In the 1700s in Europe, you had pale people there, of course. And of course, you had black people there. It's just that that story is not told. Okay, so clearly they used phenotype as a basis as to who goes where. And that's why I'm showing that slide. Next slide. And as you can see, this is further description of the different transported to the right, highlighted. You have black, curled hair, strong made, brown complexion, well made, black, ruddy, you know. So they're describing them. So we know that many of these rebel prisoners were brown and black men. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a Jamaican man, and I looked at his GED match, and the GED match DNA is a footprint, and it's a genetic footprint, if you know how to read it, of what took place in history. So let's look at his GED match, and let's look at his right column. And if you look, what do you see? He has matches to African American. That doesn't surprise me because we know that there was the intra-American, indigenous American trade that went on between the islands and the mainland. So we're not shocked that he has matches to us, just like we have matches to them. This is some of the reason we have cousin matches on DNA tests for those of us that participate. But I want you to see the Spanish, the French, the Spanish, because again, the Spaniards were there. And that makes sense before the British became involved. But I would like to go down to the very bottom because this is the focus that I want to zoom in on. The Scottish Highlands. You notice he has Scottish Highlands. So what happens in history never leaves the DNA. So we just looked at a historical event and it still shows in his DNA. That's what I'm showing here. Let's go to the next slide. So by the mid-1600s, the Irish were the main slaves sold to Antigua and Montserrat. At that time, 70% of the total population of Montserrat were Irish slaves. So if you generally think that Irish equals pale, then Montserrat should be a fair complected population. So from 1641 to 1652, over 500,000 Irish were killed by the English and another 300,000 were sold as slaves. Ireland's population fell from about 1.5 million to 600,000 in one single decade. This led to a helpless population of homeless women and children. Britain's solution was to auction them off as well. Next slide. We talked about this. We can move to the next slide. So this is Montserrat, the Irish Times. The Caribbean Irish, the other Emerald Irish, with so many islanders claiming Irish ancestry, Montserrat is proud of its green history, even if it defies the notion of the nice Irish slaveholder. Today, however, its focus is on rebuilding after natural disaster. So for a history where 70% of your enslaved are Irish, that doesn't seem to fit the narrative looking at this population. And many Montserrat people look just like that. These are Montserrat people. Let's go to the next slide. This was a video on the Black Irish of Montserrat. I wanted to point out a particular characteristic that I noted with many of them. Notice that forehead. A lot of them have prominent foreheads. Okay, you see it on the little girl and you see it on the little boy behind her. Let's go to the next slide. Joseph Williams wrote a book called Whence the Black Irish of Jamaica. And if you look, you notice those foreheads on the little boys in the picture. They carry that trait as well. It's something that is noticeable. Let's go to the next slide. Rihanna has it. Her son has it. That forehead. Let's go to the next slide. So goat water is actually a Montserratian spinoff of Irish stew. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. When you look at the culture or the cultural vestiges of Montserrat, you don't see any African cultural vestiges, not in their food, not in their culture, not in any loan words, nothing. Not even their oral history. What you keep reading is that they are African slaves from Africa, but where's the evidence of it? You just don't see it. Okay, next slide. Okay, we can move on. We spoke about that, goat water. So we're back here to the Montserrat's DNA sample. So now we understand how deeply embedded and rooted Irish slavery is with Montserrat. And they tend to get Igbo. So just because you get Igbo does not mean your ancestors come directly from Igbo land. I mean, it is possible because there was Igbo slavery. So I'm not discounting that. But you have to take into context the DNA results, the individual family, and the area that they're from. Now, if I'm looking at a result from a person where there was a large amount of Irish slavery, like Montserrat and Barbados, if I see Igbo matching, I'm not going to assume it's from Igbo slavery. And as a matter of fact, if they're from Montserrat, I know it's not from Igbo slavery. I know that that's a signal of Blackamoor Irish slavery. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And we saw this before. I showed the evidence that his ancestors came from Central and Southern Ireland, because that's the only European that shows up. Because once again, Montserrat is fairly simple in their history. It's not complex. So he doesn't have ancestors coming from all over the place. It's very simple. Most of his ancestors were brought in from Ireland. And that's why his European DNA, which of course is based on the Pale population there. And let me just say this. The reason what this DNA reflects his relatives that are actually back there. So understand that there was a color divide going on in Europe that got transported here into the New World. And I mean, regardless of how people feel about each other, it doesn't stop the fact that he has genetic cousins that are left back there. That's why he's matching Ireland, okay? And that is why we also look at DNA tests of Irish and those people who are conventionally called Irish today who are paler, and they have tiny, tiny West African DNA markers. That's not talked about, but I see their results and they do have it. Let's move to the next slide. I believe I have it in this episode. Okay, so that's his sequencing. And this is what his sequencing looks like. You will see that he has matches to the Afro-American Denver population as well, okay, because he does have indigenous DNA, because those people that came in intermingled with the original Carib Arawaks that were there in the Caribbean. And those people genetically are very similar to Afro-American people. So the genetic similarity to the Afro-American population out of Denver is expected. Okay, but notice he has that large circle in Nigeria, and you see the circle in North Africa is less, all right, compared to the Afro-American person. Now, for some Afro-Americans, that population, that circle in Nigeria is also larger, okay? This is not a one-size-fits-all. It depends, because if you come from enslaved lineages primarily, and that means you would be prone to have a lot of Caribbean ancestry. And we know that Irish slavery was huge. You indirectly will inherit this pattern. So that's what I'm also showing here. Okay. But nevertheless, he has some matching to North Africa. All right. So let's go to the next slide. And so let's look at his breakdown. This is his genetic test with the same company sequencing. And you can see he has a predominant Nigerian. But nevertheless, he also gets the Ethiopian, the Sierra Leone, Gambian, and Kenya. He still has the Amazigh pattern. Okay. And then, of course, he has the matches to Greece, Bosnia, Macedonia, Bulgaria. I'm showing this because this does not line up with the traditional story that's told to us. Okay, what is he even doing with these matches? These matches make sense if his ancestors were coming out of Europe. Absolutely, because he will still have a North African pattern, even if he has an excess Igbo pattern. He still has a North African pattern. Okay, and then of course he has some matches to Ashkenazi Jewish because of the Sephardic Jews running into other areas as well. And yes, Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews are not the same people, but for some reason, there is no Sephardic Jewish per se signature. They are allocated to Ashkenazi Jewish when they do DNA testing. So I just wanted to clarify that. All right, next slide. This is the remainder of his DNA test with sequencing, and you can see he also gets the North African matching, as I've said, but to the modern North African. All right, the Algerian, the Yemen, the Egyptian, the Tunisian, Iran, Syria, again, because that reflects the genetic spread, as I mentioned before, from the Persian Empire. That's why you see a little bit of Iranian, and they're coming down through the Levant, across North Africa. So all of this took place. It influences the DNA results of anybody who inhabited Europe, regardless of whether you were pale or dark. Okay, so that's telling you something, the fact that he has these genetic markers. This does not fit the profile of someone whose ancestors exclusively came from West Central Africa and no place else. These are the results of someone who has a decent amount of ancestry coming out of the Mediterranean and Europe. Okay, just because his DNA is predominantly African labeled does not mean those ancestors were not in Europe or in the Mediterranean. And of course, he has matching to Colombia and Haiti, Native America. That's expected because he also has lineage that was indigenous. So he's going to have matches to those populations. So let's go to the next slide. We're winding down. So again, I do a comparison because I don't want people to think that I'm cherry picking, and I like to use this against continental Africans. So this is a cousin of mine who agreed to participate, and I sent her DNA off and I did the sequencing genetic studies, and you can see this is what she gets. Okay, she's Ghanaian, Nigeria, matches to Sierra Leone and Gambia. All right, they don't have a Ghanaian sample, so the closest that they match that to is Nigeria. Okay, that's just something I'm pointing out. But she doesn't get anything else. She's not getting any matches to North Africa in a modern context. Okay, she's not getting any of that. So I'm doing a compare and a contrast. Oh, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is the DNA results of someone from Montserrat using Ancestry DNA. And they tend to get a decent amount of Benin Togo. Now, Ancestry DNA did updates. I don't, since this time in terms of, they don't use the Cameroon Congo. They use some other label, but it's still a Bantu marker. But this was an old style Ancestry DNA. But what I would like to point out is that someone from the Caribbean who is a descendant of a lot of these Black Moors from Ireland, Black Irish, true Black Irish slaves, not the nuanced new definition that they try to pretend, oh, it's somebody with Mediterranean dark hair. No, the Black Irish were black, with kinky hair and dark skins. All right, a lot of them will get high Benin Togo on ancestry DNA. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And if you look at an individual from the Irish area, I wanted to show this. You notice that 1% Benin Togo? All right, so, you know, there was a cleansing. So Europeans still have these markers to West Africa. They didn't lose it. And it may show up as 0 on conventional DNA tests because, again, when you start talking about conventional DNA tests, they reserve the right not to report tiny DNA. They could say, well, we're not going to report things that are under 1% or under 2%. That's their prerogative. But in this particular individual, it did show up. And you can see he has the 1%. So not everybody got snatched. And then, of course, you had intermixing between the paler population and the darker population. I mean, that intermixing will inevitably happen. And there was intermixing going on. So that's a vestige of the intermixing. So his brethren who were darker were taken away. And that's a vestige of some of the intermixing that took place in places in Europe. And they still have those markers. Europeans still have these markers. They may not show up on DNA tests, but it'll show up if they do third-party DNA testing. Okay. And on occasion, it will show up like here. This is an example. All right. Next slide. So you have Ogham writing that's been discovered in Ireland, and there's been all sorts of discussion, and it's very similar to what's been found in Igbo land. All right, next slide. And Catherine Ochonolu, she has passed on, but she was a notable Igbo historian, and she talked about Ogham writings and how they've been found in the British Isles and also found in Igbo land as well, because there is this connection and there is this matching to Igbo people with regard to the people in Ireland, okay? And they still get those matches, all right? It's just that naturally it's less because most of the population was taken away in slavery. Let's go to the next slide. So this is just some additional points. A lot of times we get these matches to the Greeks, the Balkans. When I was going over the genetic matches with sequencing, they showed the matches to the Greeks, the Balkans. Some of us do show it on the updated 23andMe. Well, a lot of this is related to the Romani gypsies. You know, there was a cleansing out of not only the Moorish and Sephardic Jewish population, there was a cleansing out of gypsies, Romani gypsies from Europe as well. And also there was a lot of mixing going on even before there was a cleansing. So this is why a lot of us get these matches to little tiny Balkan DNA. We don't know where that's coming from, why we have little tiny matches to Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, and North India. A lot of us don't even understand why, but that has to do with mixing. Some of the mixing may have occurred since these people were sent into the colonies and they were labeled mulattoes. They were indentured. But a lot of this mixing just took place in Europe, where you have a lot of Europeans to this day. They have these tiny markers as well. So a lot of our Afro-European ancestors were in Europe, and so they were also mixing with Romani Gypsy people. So when you see these tiny Balkan and Romanian and Bulgarian matches and you want to know where it's coming from, oftentimes it is coupled with some matching to North India, and that's just a signature of Romani Gypsy DNA. Okay, so that's just an additional point that I'm pointing out to the audience. We can go to the next slide. So this is a Peruvian, all right? And oftentimes when I look at results from South America or Latin America, period, they show the end results of who came in. So we know they were colonized by the Spaniards. They weren't colonized by a multitude of different people. They were just strictly colonized by the Spaniards. So why do we see this pattern? Notice this is a similar North African pattern: the Ghanaian, the Nigerian, the Senegambia, the Congolese, and then you have the Northeast African going on here with the Sudanese. I'm just showing that this is a consistent pattern because, again, who did the Spaniards use in their armies? They used Moors, they used Jews, again, who were black. These people converted to Christianity, and nevertheless, they were in their armies, and we must know that pale Spaniards alone could not have conquered the Americas. They used the people that were subdued, and they used them in their army. So wherever they went, you will see these types of DNA patterns. Okay, now this is a person in Peru who has a substantial amount of African genetics, so it's a little bit more pronounced. But I can tell you, no matter how pale the person is, throughout Latin America, they will always have these tiny markers to Senegal, a little bit of Ghana, Nigeria. Those are Amizigh North African genetic patterns, because the modern North African reflects something that took place in more recent times during the Umayyad dynasty and the spreading of that DNA. But it doesn't mean that that's exclusive to North Africa. That just represents the miscegenated portion. I keep repeating that, but this actually is a North African pattern that we're looking at here. We can go to the next slide. And again, this is the remainder of that person's DNA, and we can see the primary European area where these individuals came from, Spain. So these DNA tests are just nothing but footprints of the history. So that's where that African DNA primarily came from. It came from Spain because they sent their people out first to do the mining. Because isn't it easier and just logical to subdue if you already subdue the population in your vicinity, isn't it easier and isn't it just more logical to use those individuals than to go across the pond and use individuals that can't communicate with you and don't understand your system or language? Let's just think about that. So that's why we're seeing this. Okay, next slide. So if you look at the matches to Spain, you will see that for many Spaniards, they will have a pattern that looks like this. Okay, you have a little bit of Italy because you had the Roman Empire coming into Spain, and you have the vestige of the Jewish population there. So you have this Ashkenazi Jewish, and then Sardinia represents an older element. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide. And you can see with the Spaniard, they get the matches to the modern North African, but you have the vestige of the unmixed North African, the Senegambian. That's why I'm showing this. Okay, so this is a reflection of what's going on in Spain today. So you can cleanse out a population, but you can't get 100% of their DNA out, right? So just think of it this way: the people that were more of the bottom, right, were the ones that were sent out, and a little bit of the mulatto, which represents the purple, the modern North African. Okay, so this is who was sent out, mainly the bottom. Okay, and that's why we get those markers, but in larger proportions. But it still shows up in the Spaniard, and this is what we routinely see. Next slide. So this is someone from Jamaica looking at their GED match. And when we look at the secondary population on the right side, again, this reflects the history. So who were these people that came in? And look where they were from. This is a footprint: Castilla, Aragon, Portuguese. Castilla, Andalusia, Cantabria, Extremadura. These are places in Spain where the Moors and the Sephardic Jews inhabited. Valencia. So I'm just showing you, this is not my history. This is just what the DNA shows. The DNA is the evidence. Okay, next slide. Winding down. Okay, so this is another person from Jamaica. And sometimes this is what we see. Okay, so you see also the English. See, the English then comes in later. So you have that mixing, all right? And then you have the German, the Dutch, the French, and you see this person shows the vestige of what took place earlier. Spanish Cataluna, you see the Spanish Cantabria, okay? I'm just, again, showing how DNA is a footprint. Let's go to the next slide. This is another Jamaican, all right? And you can again see who was the people that came in. Mozabite is a type of people coming out of the area of Algeria, okay? They are a type of Amizigh people, but they are called Mozabites. You have Moroccans. Of course, you have the Bantu, which represents the older element, which was firmly established from ancient times, which was global and here in the Americas. And then, of course, you have these matches to Scotland, Orkney, and all of these people, because, again, there was a cleansing out. And these people that they cleaned out, they weren't pure. Of course not, they weren't pure. Even if they were predominantly African genetically, they were not pure. And, of course, you had mixing with the pale people even since then. You know, there was rape and there was also mixing. So that also occurred. Then you have the Irish, the British, the Ethiopian Jews, and the matches to the Ethiopian Jews. Let me explain that. That's just matching, again, an Amizigh vestige where you have matching two-horn Africans, and that still shows up. All right, so let's go to the next slide. And this is another Jamaican, and you can see the matches to Puerto Rico, which just the Puerto Rican is used as a marker of Taino heritage. By no means there were the Tainos only in Puerto Rico. They were all over the Caribbean, and they weren't only just Asian phenotype. I gotta emphasize that because there's a downplaying of the Negro phenotype of indigenous people here in the Americas, but that's another topic. And you have the matches to the Basque, the Iberian, Portuguese, Corsica, and going down, yeah, I highlighted it. Lumbee, again, Lumbee is an amalgamated group. They are amalgamated Suwan, Algonquian, Iroquois people. They were recently created, but that's the groups that they derived from, okay, and Southeast North Carolina. And you can see he has matching because, again, that's a reflection of the intra-American slave trade, because you had people that were taken from the East Coast during the wars, particularly the men that weren't killed, and they were sent to places like Jamaica and Barbados and Bermuda, Bermuda and different places like that. So you had a back and forth going on, and he reflects that. So again, if you look at DNA tests, it's a footprint to what took place historically. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is the Montserrat, and this is one of his MDLPs. I believe this is the Eurogenes, actually, not the MDLP, but it's Jet Match. And when you look at the right column, the reason why I'm showing that is because you will find that a lot of the people who have Irish heritage, they also have matches to Russia. Because what's not taught enough is that the paler population came from the area of Central Asia, Russia area, and they migrated into Europe. Okay, so even though he's not pale, his ancestors were seated in Ireland for centuries. Okay, so they intermixed with the new coming paler population, and that's why he has matches to Russia. Okay, and I've noticed this not only with him, but with other people who have that lineage out of islands with a lot of Irish slavery. and they will have high percentages of African genetics, but they still have these matches to Russia. That is a reflection of what took place in terms of the migrations, okay? Because the pale population comes from Central Asia, and they originated out of that area of Russia, okay? Let's go to the next slide. All right, so almost finished. We have a company called Native DNA. Some of your listening audience will be familiar with it. And it's very nice, again, to use third-party DNA companies, because there you have far less bias and you get to see the truth. All right. So this is an example of our office manager. Her family's from Honduras, and she's what we would call a mestiza. So she has a little bit of what we call African DNA, but most of her DNA is actually European and the people that we call Native American. All right. Oh, so let's look at her matches to the right. Okay. We're going to focus on the right side column. So you can see she's matching Mexico. And this is based on matches to the populations that are there now. Let me just point that out. So we can see Mexico, Southwest Spain, the Basque, Pima, Nahua, Mexico, Eastern Ukraine, Apaches, Mayas, Mercia, Scotland, Cochimi, Bergamo, Italy, Salish, which is a native group out of Montana, the Sioux out of Minnesota, the Netherlands, Ashkenazi Jews, Ojibwa, Ontario. I'm showing this for a reason. And this is based on populations that willingly participated with genetic studies. Okay, so this is modern day matching. This is her DNA. And let's go to the next slide. Okay. That's just, we can see here at the bottom, she matches Siberia, Mongolia, China. So you can see even the matches go back, which also reflects migrations, ancient migrations, and she still has matches to those populations. We can go to the next slide. All right, so this is someone who's Afro-American, and I want you to look at the populations again to the right. And you can see here, of course, this individual matches what? African-American. We expect to Gambia, Mandinka. We talked about that. Those are Moorish signals. All right. You have some matching to the Isan Yoruba. Okay. We talked about that as well, being part of the North African. You have the Mali. All right. Part of the North Africa. You have some matching to Angola. Okay. Angola being part of that Bantu complex. Then what do you have here? Look, Berber, Tunisia. And that reflects the population there. What is a so-called African-American doing with matches to Tunisian Berbers? Let's just keep moving. Fulani, Gambia, Germany, Ojibwa, Ethiopia. We spoke about that. Scotland, Ashkenazi Jewish, Cherokee, Lenni Lenape, Muskegean. And then we're going down. Vikings, Catalonia, Spain, Balochi, Pakistan. We spoke about that too, reflecting Romani Gypsies, Turkey, Taino, which is based on a Bahamian sample, Basque, Bitterroot, Salish, Sardinia, Pima, Nua. So you can see none of these results reflect what is traditionally imposed on us. This is an individual who is showing matches to Southeast tribes who participated. And also you can see the Moorish genetic pattern, because I explained earlier, and I said it several times, that Moorish Amizigh pattern will have matches to the Senegambian region, will have matches to Nigeria. You will get all of those matches. So that's what we see. So we also will see the Fulani matching. We will also see matches to modern North Africa, which is why you see the matches to Berber, Tunisia. All right, next slide. Okay, so again, this is another so-called Afro-American, and you can see same thing. African-American, Gambia, Mandinka, Isan, Yoruba, Mali, Fulani, Berber out of Algeria, Germany, Ethiopia, Ojibwa, Scotland, Ashkenazi Jewish, Cherokee, Ghana, Lenni Lenape, Algonquian, Iceland, Chickasaw, Viking, Castillo and Leon, Roma, Jews, Gujarat, India, again, the Roma Gypsies. And in some cases, remember I spoke about, and I showed you in Paul Heinig's document, that there was indentured Indian men from England who came in. So some of us get additional matches to India, not just from Romani Gypsy, but some of those indentured servants that came in from England were from South Asia originally, okay? They were part of the Lascars, and those were the men who manned the ships, okay? Because the actual British themselves were in control, but the people who were their ship drivers were many from India, Southeast Asia, and even some of them were Somali. A lot of people don't know that. And a lot of them settled in England. So some of them came into the colonies. And then, of course, you have matches to Lebanon, Gujarat, the Sioux, the Taino. Again, I'm just showing how using third-party tests where nobody has an agenda to hide the truth, these are the types of DNA matching that so-called Afro-Americans will have. And now it makes sense. So when you guys get results showing matches to Gambia, Senegal, and in Mali, in Nigeria, it does not mean you had ancestors taken from there, but in fact, those are North African signals. And yes, you very well may have ancestors that were taken there, but there's a consistent pattern here. And that does not explain our genetic findings, okay? That doesn't exclude in different ones who had actual ancestors that were taken from coastal areas, because that happened. But that was not the main story. That's why that's not the main genetic pattern. That's all I'm saying. Next slide. I'm just showing the breakdown. This is a Jamaican, okay? And you can see his main lineage, of course, is labeled Sub-Saharan African, European. He gets tiny little bit of Asian-derived Native American, and then Middle Eastern Jewish and South Asian, again, reflecting the history. That's why I'm just showing this, okay? Let's go to the next slide. And if you look at the right, his first match, it just makes sense. He's from the Caribbean, so he's matching the African Caribbean test population. Again, what do you see? Mandinka, you see Bokoko, Cameroon. Again, that's the Bantu matching. He has matches to the Yoruba, which is involved with the North African. The North Africans get matches to Yoruba people. The Fulani matching, which is a common signature. I've even seen that on Algerians, Fulani matching. And Isan matches to Nigeria. I've seen that as well in North Africans. You got the matches to Mali, Algeria, Hausa, Maasai, which is an old, which is matching an old ancient Bantu element. Bantu, Namibia. Okay, this is all ancient pre-Columbian. Berber, Morocco. You see the modern North African mixing. Ethiopia, as I said before, because they migrated out of Ethiopia. Then, of course, you had the Canary Islands, which was often used as a point of dispersion. Matches to Vikings, France, Germany, Sardinia, Italy. Of course, the Jewish, Sephardic Jews get this match to the Ashkenazi Jews. They don't have their own marker, as I mentioned before. Lithuania, which a lot of the Gypsies also have matches to Lithuania. A lot of them were also there, so we also can get matches to that. Turkey, Algonquian, Egypt, Taino, Jawar, Roma, Lebanon, Nawua, Pashtun, okay, Pakistan. So again, I'm showing the consistency here. This is a person from Jamaica, born and bred. Next slide.
That's actually the last slide we have.
Okay, so that concludes it. So basically, I gave, in this 3 lectures, I talked about who the Moors were. I identified their phenotypes based on paintings. I talked about the genotypes. I talked about where these genotypes are found, how to think beyond the countries that they label these DNA tests as belonging to. I showed evidence that Europeans today have tiny markers of these North and West Africans. I showed a person from the Levant. They have these tiny markers from North and West Africa as well. I showed that that DNA was not exclusive to West Africa. In fact, they migrated oftentimes out of the Levant. They were widespread from the Levant, North Africa, in the area we are now calling Middle East, into West Africa. And I showed the genetic patterns. I showed how we have DNA matches that does not line up with the traditional story of the slave trade. I show that the genetic matches that we have to Europe would only make sense if the bulk of our ancestors came from Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let me just say this. I'm not saying that we're Moors. I'm not saying that we are Afro-Europeans. What I am saying is that for many of us, we in fact are indigenous, but the people that came in were primarily from Europe, even if they were dark and dominated by African genetics. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that there was no African slave trade, because there was an African slave trade. But what I do know is that that's the only narrative told. But what I see genetically is that's not the main influence in our DNA. That's what I'm saying. And I think that without a shadow of a doubt, that these Moorish markers are exaggerated in terms of the percentages, because what they're really hiding is that there was a DNA here that was not Asian derived, that was ancient. And I spoke about that a number of times for those who want to go back and listen to it, that is most genetically similar to the Bantu population of Africa. No, they're not from the Bantu population of Africa, but they share genetics, and that was global. The owner of Native DNA even talked about how the Polynesians have 20 to 25% of that similar DNA to the Bantu population as well. And his grandfather was Hawaiian, so that was a personal thing. And then finally, I ended it off by showing the GED matches, which is a third-party test. I showed sequencing, which is another third-party test. And finally, I showed native DNA testing. All of these are third-party tests, so you can see that that is not just a theory that I'm throwing out here, but that the DNA is consistent. And that will conclude my series.
That was
Beautiful.
very powerful. that
Yes.
was very powerful.
I agree. I actually had to take a moment and pull up my 23andMe so follow along, because I saw some similarities there. And I'm like, wait, hold on, let me see. Do I have that? Do I have this? Not only that, I pulled up my true ancestry as well. And I did have a question, but you ended up answering that, because you were talking about how they went and cleaned out people in these certain areas. And I was thinking about the original people in those areas being of darker complexion, Black people.
Mm-hmm.
But also the fact that the Peller races did come from some of those regions of Europe and Russia and all those areas. We were talking about the mixing of them, that was my question, if they were indeed like a mixture, or were they more of the original people, or were they the Pale people that came down to create these different, or to bring about all the different admixtures and things that we're seeing in these results.
Basically, you had, okay, let me say this. The Moors, as we know them, right? The North Africans were not the most ancient people of Europe. Okay, we know Khoisan and Pygmies were global ancient people that were all over the planet. You had various darker people that existed in Europe. If you go back, it could have been part one, and I've spoken about it even when I addressed indigenous American DNA. I spoke about Otzi, and Otzi was not Moorish, actually, in his genetic composition, even though he was quite miscegenated. If you looked at his original component, it was primarily Pygmy and a little bit of Bantu. So they were actually the older people of the planet, the Pygmies, and then you had another type of DNA, Bantu type DNA, that came after the Pygmies and the Khoisan. And then afterwards, you had a different type of African genetics that appeared on the scene, West African type genetics. They are new. They are actually not that old. See, a lot of people automatically ascribe ancient to African and darkness, but there are different ages of African genetics. Pygmy
Absolutely.
Pythons are older. Bantu people are older than West Africans. And if you look at the DNA that dominates people of the Americas, and in the global scheme, they are Bantu dominant. Okay, when you start seeing West African genetic markers, they are younger. So no one can, that's why a West African can never say to us, we are your parents, because the primary genetic composition of our people is older than theirs. That's not even lining up genetically. Did we intermix with West African genetics? Absolutely, because there was trades going on. And then, of course, we know that the North Africans and the West Africans were the Moors, and they were dominated by that type of DNA. But they were not the most ancient people in Europe. They replaced the Otsis. They replaced them. You understand? But they are not the most ancient people. And then, of course, you had the migration of the paler population that came in. And before I even go there, I sort of touched up on it. You had an older population as well who were related to the people of India that was established. Because if you just look at the map, there's no real border between Europe, as we call it, and India. So there was a natural genetic spread of that population, and they existed throughout Europe. And they would give us South Asian genetic markers. If you look at even Otzi, he had matches to India as well. So you had that. And then, of course, you had the Romani people coming in as migrants that came in out of the North India area, adding to it. But there was South Asian genetics already mixing in that was there in Europe just as a natural progression and a migration. So Europe was indeed a melting pot, pardon me. And then you had the paler people that came out of Central Asia, and they migrated carrying the haplogroup R with them, R1A, R1B, and they migrated and came from that region. And this is why you will find matches to Russia in people from Ireland and Scotland, because that's their ancient home. And that is also reflected in many of the samples I've seen also of Caribbean people who are dark skinned with predominant African genetics, and they will have these matches to Russia on their GED matches. I'm not talking about based on anything recent, but very deep. In fact, a friend of mine who's 100% African, who's from Guyana, who roots come out of Barbados, she is 100% African. She looks like her facial features is just like Lucia. She has high cheekbones and a flat face, and she has an oral tori in the roof of her mouth. So you can't get more indigenous looking than this woman. But if you look at her very deep genetics, she has these matches to Russia. That's because with roots coming out of Barbados, many Guyanese people, Afro-Guyanese people have roots out of Barbados, and she's one of them. You will see that's the influence of the Irish slavery. Because of her Black ancestors coming out of Ireland, they did mix with the paler population who had origins out of the Russian area. So all of these things are footprints. I don't know if I answered your question, Phoenix.
Yes, you did. You did. And I appreciate it. I do want to talk with you further, if you don't mind, after the show.
Yes.
Just to get some, I don't know, maybe I can get your eyes and your opinion on something here. Okay. But we really appreciate you for coming back and for, bringing it all home for us. As always, it is a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Such a wealth of knowledge and information. We do have a playlist of all of Dr. Fatou's shows, so you guys can go ahead and watch them in order if you'd like. And then her previous shows that she has had as well. And we'll continue to add her shows as she becomes, as she comes on the show later on.
Absolutely. I definitely would want her to come back, most definitely, because Fatou is very brilliant. I don't think people understand like the parts that she just did. I'm sitting right next to our library here, and a great majority of everything she said is right in these books over here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So she just basically solidified it with the DNA that the Moorish aspect is here.
Absolutely. It also coincided with a lot of Dr. Marie Charles's studies too.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things that was said kind of brought some of those things to my remembrance. So you know how we do. We do these shows and then we go bringing stuff together and, you know, discussing and, you know, connecting the dots with everything. And we hope that you all do that as well. Take your notes and go and discover these things for yourself. With that being said, would you like to say anything in closing, Miko?
Oh no, I just thank Dr. Fatou for even doing this, because Dr. Fatou can be doing like a million things today, but she came to present this beautiful information to us. Yeah. I got so much information just sitting right here on my desk from writing everything she was saying. I couldn't keep up with her at first, but I'm gonna rewatch this again like I do with all our shows.
Of course. Well, again, thank you so much, Dr. Fatou. And we want to thank everybody for tuning in and being here with us. Of course, you could have been anywhere else in the world, but you are here with us, and we most definitely appreciate it. So I'm going to say, Shapisha Lashake. Until next time.